When most people think of ancient Egypt, they imagine pyramids piercing the desert sky, golden death masks gleaming in museum cases, hieroglyphs carved into temple walls telling stories of gods and pharaohs. The popular imagination sees Egypt through the lens of monumentality, of grand architecture and royal tombs, of spectacular treasures that survived millennia buried in sand. And yes, that happened. The pyramids are real, the temples stood, the treasures existed. Ancient Egypt created some of humanity's most enduring architectural and artistic achievements. But here's what the textbooks don't spend much time on, what museums rarely display, what gets left out of nearly every documentary about ancient Egypt. The ordinary objects, the everyday tools, the mundane items that filled Egyptian homes, workshops, and fields. The things people actually used day after day, year after year, century after century. Not golden funeral masks or jeweled pectorals, but bread molds and fish hooks. Not elaborate temple reliefs, but simple pottery bowls. Not royal scepters, but carpenters' adzes and farmers' hoes. For every magnificent artifact that ended up in a pharaoh's tomb, there were 10,000 ordinary objects used by ordinary Egyptians living ordinary lives. Bakers needed ovens, fishermen needed nets, scribes needed pens, weavers needed looms, farmers needed plows, carpenters needed saws. Every profession, every craft, every daily activity required tools, and those tools were made by hand, used until they broke, repaired when possible, and eventually discarded when they could no longer function. And occasionally, just occasionally, they survived in the archaeological record, giving us glimpses into the daily reality of life in ancient Egypt. This is the story of those objects, not the spectacular ones, not the rare ones, not the ones that make headlines when they're discovered. The boring ones, the common ones, the ones that wouldn't look out of place in a modern tool, shed or kitchen. Because human needs haven't changed that much in 5,000 years. People still need to eat, to build, to make clothing, to store food, to cook, to work, to create. And the basic tools and objects required for those activities were, in many cases, remarkably similar to what we still use today. Ancient Egyptian tools and everyday objects tell a different story than the monumental architecture does. They tell the story of how people actually lived, not how pharaohs ruled, or how priests worshipped, or how nobles were buried, but how ordinary Egyptians, the vast majority of the population, who left no written records and had no grand tombs, went about their daily existence. The objects reveal the ingenuity, the practicality, the adaptation to environment, and the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that endured for 3,000 years. So tonight, we're not talking about King Tut's treasures or the Rosetta Stone. We're not discussing the construction of the pyramids or the religious beliefs encoded in the Book of the Dead. We're talking about the part of Egyptian life that was frankly deeply mundane. The tools people used to grind grain and weave cloth, the containers they used to store beer and oil, the implements they used to apply makeup and cut hair, the fishing equipment, the farming tools, the carpenter's kit, the scribe's palette, the boring, repetitive, utterly essential objects that made Egyptian civilization function. And in a strange way, that makes it more interesting. Because these objects reveal something the grand monuments don't. They reveal how people solved problems, how they adapted to a challenging environment, how they passed knowledge from generation to generation through apprenticeship and practice, how they maintained a remarkably stable material culture across centuries, how they made do with limited resources, creating sophisticated solutions using stone, wood, copper, bronze, and whatever else was available. The objects are windows into daily life. They show us what mattered, what was valued, what was necessary. They reveal social hierarchies, economic systems, technological capabilities, and cultural priorities. A simple grinding stone tells us about diet and labor. A fishing net tells us about food acquisition and craft specialization. A carpenter's adze tells us about woodworking techniques and tool design. Every object has a story, and collectively, those stories paint a far more complete picture of ancient Egypt than any royal inscription ever could. Let's start with the most fundamental human need, food. And in ancient Egypt, food meant grain, primarily barley and emmer wheat, the foundation of the Egyptian diet, ground into flour and baked into bread or brewed into beer. Grain cultivation, processing, and storage dominated Egyptian life to an extent that's hard for modern people who buy processed food in supermarkets to truly comprehend. For ancient Egyptians, managing grain was a constant, year-round concern that required specialized tools and enormous labor. The agricultural cycle began with plowing, and the Egyptian plow was a remarkably simple yet effective tool. It wasn't the heavy iron plows that would appear much later in European agriculture. It was a light wooden implement, essentially a sharpened stick, mounted at an angle, pulled by oxen. The plow didn't turn the soil over like modern plows. It simply scratched furrows into the soft, flood-deposited silt that covered the fields after the Nile's annual inundation. The plow's simplicity was its strength. It was light enough to be maneuvered easily in the soft soil. It was made primarily from locally available wood, usually acacia, which grew along the Nile. The cutting edge, the part that actually penetrated the soil, was sometimes tipped with copper or bronze in wealthier farming communities, but many plows remained purely wooden throughout ancient Egyptian history. The metal tip lasted longer and penetrated harder ground more easily, but it wasn't essential. Wood worked fine in the soft post-flood soil. The plow was pulled by a yoke of oxen, two animals harnessed together with wooden yokes that rested on their shoulders. Controlling the plow required skill. The farmer walked behind, guiding the implement, keeping it at the right depth, ensuring the furrows were straight and evenly spaced. It was exhausting work. The sun beat down mercilessly, the oxen moved slowly but required constant attention. The plow occasionally struck stones or roots hidden in the soil, jarring the farmer's hands and arms, but it was essential. Without plowing, seeds couldn't be planted properly. Without proper planting, crops failed, and crop failure meant famine. After plowing came sowing, and this required different tools. Seeds were carried in baskets or sacks made from woven plant fibers. The sower walked through the plowed fields, reaching into the basket, grabbing handfuls of seed and broadcasting them across the furrows with sweeping arm motions. It was skilled work. Throw too much seed and you wasted precious grain. Throw too little and the crop would be sparse. The sower had to distribute seeds evenly, covering the entire field, ensuring good germination and growth. Some seeds were then covered by dragging branches across the field or by driving sheep or goats over the planted areas. The animals' hooves pressed the seeds into the soil, giving them better contact with moisture and protecting them from birds. This wasn't sophisticated agriculture by modern standards, but it worked. Egypt's crops grew reliably year after year, feeding millions of people and generating surpluses that supported the entire civilization. Harvesting required another set of tools, primarily sickles. Egyptian sickles were distinctive, made from wood with cutting edges formed by multiple small flint blades set into grooves along one side. The flint blades were sharp, capable of cutting through grain stalks cleanly, but they dulled quickly. Harvesters carried replacement blades, swapping them out as needed throughout the day. Later, as bronze became more common, metal sickle blades appeared, more durable than flint, though also more expensive. The sickle was held in one hand, while the other hand grasped a bundle of grain stalks. The harvester cut through the stalks with a sawing motion, accumulated a bundle, and then laid it aside to be collected later. It was back-breaking work. Harvesters bent over constantly, reaching for the grain, cutting, bundling, moving forward, repeating the process thousands of times per day. The heat was intense. The dust from the fields irritated throats and eyes. Insects swarmed. But the harvest had to be brought in quickly, before grain overripened and fell from the stalks, before storms damaged standing crops, before any of the countless things that could go wrong with agriculture went wrong. After harvesting, grain had to be threshed to separate the edible kernels from the inedible chaff. Threshing happened on flat, circular threshing floors, hardened surfaces where harvested grain was spread out and animals were driven over it repeatedly. Oxen or donkeys walked in circles, their hooves crushing the grain stalks and loosening the kernels. Sometimes threshing sledges were used, wooden platforms studded with stones or metal bits on the underside, dragged over the grain by animals. The weight and friction broke the stalks apart, freeing the kernels. Once threshed, the grain was winnowed, tossed into the air using wooden scoops or winnowing fans. The wind carried away the lighter chaff, while the heavier grain fell back to the ground. It was tedious, repetitive work that required patience and good wind conditions. Too little wind and the chaff didn't separate. Too much wind and you lost grain. The winnower developed a feel for it, learning how high to toss, how much to scoop, how to work with the wind rather than against it. The cleaned grain then went into storage. Storage containers ranged from small pottery jars for household use to enormous granaries for state or temple grain reserves. The granaries were remarkable structures, massive buildings with thick mud brick walls and narrow openings at the top. Grain was poured in from above and removed from below through small doors that could be sealed. The design protected grain from moisture, pests, and theft. Government scribes carefully recorded how much grain went in and came out, tracking taxes, surpluses, and distributions with obsessive detail. But before grain could be eaten, it had to be ground into flour, and this required the most ubiquitous tool in ancient Egypt, the grinding stone. Every household had one. Every day, women and sometimes children spent hours grinding grain, a task so fundamental to Egyptian life that it defined the daily rhythm of domestic existence. The grinding stone, called a saddle quern, consisted of two parts. The lower stone was a large, flat or slightly concave piece of granite or other hard stone placed on the ground or on a low platform. The upper stone was smaller, usually oval or rectangular, designed to fit comfortably in two hands. Grain was placed on the lower stone, and the upper stone was pushed back and forth across it, crushing the kernels between the two surfaces. It sounds simple. It was brutally hard work. The upper stone was heavy, often weighing 10 or 15 pounds. Pushing it back and forth required strength and endurance. The motion was repetitive, monotonous, and exhausting. The grinding action was noisy, a constant scraping, grinding sound that filled Egyptian homes every morning as women prepared the day's flour. And the process was never quite complete. Egyptian flour was coarse, full of tiny stone particles, ground off the quern stones themselves, mixed with the grain. This grit wore down Egyptian teeth terribly, creating dental problems that plagued even young adults. Archaeological studies of Egyptian skeletons show extreme tooth wear, even in teenagers and young adults. The grinding stone's grit, consumed with every bite of bread, literally ground down teeth to the roots. It was painful, debilitating, and nearly universal. But there was no alternative. Grain had to be ground, flour had to be made, bread had to be baked, and the grinding stone was the only tool available for the job. The grinding process took hours. To produce enough flour for a family's daily bread required grinding grain for several hours every morning. Women sat or knelt beside the grinding stone, pushing and pulling the upper stone back and forth, adding more grain as needed, scraping the flour into containers. Their hands ached, their shoulders and backs hurt. The dust from the grinding irritated their lungs. But it had to be done, every day, without exception. Some wealthy households had servants or slaves to do the grinding. This was considered one of the worst, most tedious jobs in the household, assigned to the lowest status individuals. But most Egyptian families did their own grinding, and it fell primarily to women and girls. Young girls learned by helping their mothers, starting with small amounts of grain, gradually building the strength and endurance needed for the task. By the time they married and established their own households, they were experienced grinders, capable of producing the flour their families needed. The grinding stone was so fundamental to Egyptian life that it appears constantly in art, literature, and archaeology. Tomb paintings show women grinding grain. Literary texts mention grinding as the epitome of hard, essential labor. Archaeological excavations find grinding stones in virtually every domestic context, often worn down to thin, barely functional fragments, used until they literally couldn't be used anymore. The grinding stone was Egypt, as much as pyramids or hieroglyphs, a tool that defined daily existence. For millions of people across 3,000 years, once grain was ground into flour, it had to be baked into bread, and this required another set of specialized tools and equipment. Egyptian bread wasn't like modern bread. It came in dozens of varieties, different shapes, sizes, textures, and flavors, each requiring specific baking techniques and equipment. But the basic process was similar. Mix flour with water, add leavening if you wanted raised bread, shape the dough and bake it. Baking happened in ovens, and Egyptian ovens were simple but effective. The most common type was a beehive-shaped structure made from mud bricks or clay, about waist-high with a small opening at the bottom for fuel and a larger opening at the top for loading bread. Fire was built inside using wood, dried dung, or crop residue. Once the oven was hot, the fire was raked out or pushed to one side, and bread was placed inside to bake in the residual heat. Some bread was baked in molds, conical pottery, containers that held the dough during baking. The molds were placed directly in the hot oven or buried in hot ashes. Molded bread had distinctive shapes and sizes, standardized for easy distribution and accounting. Other bread was shaped by hand and baked directly on the oven floor or on heated stones. Flatbreads, similar to modern pita, were common, baked quickly on hot surfaces and eaten fresh. The baking process required skill and experience. The baker had to judge when the oven was hot enough, not by thermometer, which didn't exist, but by feel and experience. Too hot and the bread burned. Not hot enough and it didn't cook through. The baker had to know how long to bake different types of bread, when to rotate loaves for even cooking, when to remove them before they overcooked. It was an art as much as a craft, learned through years of practice. Bread wasn't just food, it was currency, wages, offerings. Workers were paid in bread rations. Temples made thousands of loaves daily as offerings to gods. Bread was wealth, stability, life itself. The tools and equipment for making bread, from grinding stones to ovens to baking molds, were thus among the most important objects in ancient Egypt, essential to the functioning of the entire society. But bread wasn't the only product made from grain. Beer was equally important, perhaps more so. Egyptians drank beer daily at every meal because water from the Nile, while plentiful, was often unsafe. Beer, with its slight alcohol content and the boiling involved in production, was safer to drink and more nutritious than water alone. Beer production was a major industry, requiring specialized tools and considerable skill. Beer was made from partially baked bread. Bread was baked just enough to convert the starches, but not enough to kill all the yeast. The bread was then crumbled into water, left to ferment, and strained. The result was a thick, nutritious, slightly alcoholic beverage that didn't resemble modern beer at all. It was more like a liquid bread, providing calories, vitamins, and hydration. The tools for beer production included large pottery vats for fermentation, strainers for removing solids, and storage jars for the finished product. Strainers were particularly important, usually made from woven reeds or cloth, filtering out the grain solids while letting the liquid through. Beer storage jars were ubiquitous in Egyptian households, tall amphorae with narrow necks and pointed bottoms, designed to be partially buried in sand or placed in stands. Beer and bread production consumed enormous amounts of Egyptian labor and resources. Large estates and temples employed hundreds of workers just for baking and brewing. The tools and equipment were constantly in use, constantly wearing out, constantly being replaced. The grinding stones, ovens, fermentation vats, and storage jars formed the backbone of Egyptian material culture, the unglamorous but absolutely essential objects that kept people fed and hydrated. Beyond agriculture and food preparation, Egyptians needed tools for countless other daily activities. Fishing was a major food source, especially for people living along the Nile, and fishing required specialized equipment developed over millennia. Egyptian fish hooks were remarkably sophisticated, made from copper or bronze, shaped with curved points and barbs to hold fish securely. The hooks came in various sizes for different fish species, from small hooks for catching Nile perch to larger hooks for catfish. The hooks were attached to lines made from twisted plant fibers, usually flax or papyrus. Line making was a craft in itself, requiring skill to twist fibers into strong, consistent cordage that wouldn't break under the strain of a struggling fish. The lines were attached to wooden poles or rods, though many fishermen simply hand-lined, holding the line directly and feeling for bites. Nets were even more important than hooks for commercial fishing. Egyptian fishing. Nets came in several types. Seine nets were long nets with floats on top and weights on the bottom, stretched between two boats, or between a boat and the shore. The nets were dragged through the water, encircling schools of fish and trapping them. Cast nets were circular nets thrown by hand, sinking over fish and trapping them as the weighted edges fell. Gill nets were set nets left in the water, catching fish that swam into them and got tangled in the mesh. Making nets was skilled, time-consuming work. Fibers had to be processed into thin, strong thread. The thread was then knotted into mesh using specific patterns that created the right size openings for the target fish species. The mesh had to be consistent, strong, and properly shaped. Floats made from wood or bundled reeds kept the top of the net at the surface. Weights made from stone or baked clay kept the bottom down. A large fishing net represented weeks or months of work and caring for nets, repairing damage, replacing worn. Sections was an ongoing task. Fish traps were another method, woven baskets or cages placed in the water with openings that allowed fish to enter but not escape. The traps were baited and left overnight, then checked in the morning. Trap making required basketry skills, weaving reeds or palm fronds into tight, durable structures that could withstand being submerged and handled repeatedly. Fishing spears were used for larger fish in shallow water. The spears had multiple prongs, often barbed, mounted on long wooden shafts. The fisher waited patiently for a fish to come within range, then struck quickly, pinning the fish against a river or canal bottom. Spearfishing required excellent hand-eye coordination, patience, and intimate knowledge of fish behavior. All these fishing tools, hooks, lines, nets, traps, spears, were handmade by specialists or by fishermen themselves during slow periods. They represented accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. A boy learning to fish learned not just fishing techniques, but also tool making. He learned to shape hooks, twist lines, knot nets, weave traps. By the time he was an adult fisher, he could make and repair all his equipment, ensuring he could always fish regardless of circumstances. The tools of fishing, like the tools of agriculture, were fundamentally practical, designed to solve specific problems with locally available materials. There was no unnecessary ornamentation, no decoration for its own sake. These were working tools, used hard, repaired often, replaced when they broke. They weren't art objects, they were survival equipment, but their design showed sophistication, understanding of materials and mechanics, refinement through generations of use and improvement. Egyptian carpenters needed an entirely different set of tools, specialized implements for working wood into furniture, boats, buildings, and countless other objects. Wood was precious in Egypt, which had limited forests. Most timber was imported from Lebanon for cedar, from Africa for ebony, though local acacia and sycamore provided some building material. The value of wood meant carpenters had to work carefully, minimizing waste, using every scrap. The carpenter's toolkit included several essential items. The adze was primary, a tool still used in some parts of the world today. It consisted of a wooden handle, with a copper or bronze blade mounted at a right angle to the shaft, oriented so the cutting edge faced the user. The carpenter held the adze in two hands and swung it toward himself, shaving off wood with each stroke. It sounds dangerous, and it required skill and care, but it was incredibly effective for shaping wood, smoothing surfaces, and removing material quickly. Different adzes served different purposes. Heavy adzes with thick blades were used for rough shaping. Light adzes with thin, sharp blades were used for finishing work. Some adzes had curved blades for shaping curved surfaces carpenters owned. Multiple adzes, selecting the appropriate tool for each task. The blades needed frequent sharpening, a task done with stones, carefully maintaining the edge angle and sharpness necessary for clean cutting. Saws came in several varieties. Egyptian saws cut on the pull stroke rather than the push stroke, opposite to modern Western saws. The blades were made from copper or bronze, with teeth bent alternately left and right to create a kerf wider than the blade thickness, preventing binding. Saws were used to cut planks from logs, to cut pieces to length, to make straight cuts that would be difficult with an adze. Saws were attached to handles in various configurations. Some were mounted in a wooden frame that kept the blade under tension, similar to a modern bow saw. Others were simply blades with handles, more like a modern handsaw. Large two-person saws existed for cutting logs, one person on each end, pulling alternately. Sawing was hard work, especially in the Egyptian heat, cutting through dense hardwoods that quickly dulled the bronze blades. Chisels were essential for joinery, for cutting mortises and shaping joints. Egyptian chisels were simple, a bronze blade with a wooden handle, struck with a wooden mallet to drive the blade into the wood. Chisels came in various widths, from narrow chisels for detailed work to broad chisels for removing large amounts of material quickly. Like all bronze tools, chisels needed frequent sharpening and careful use to avoid bending or breaking the relatively soft metal blade. Drills allowed carpenters to make holes, essential for dowel joints and for attaching hardware. The most common type was the bow drill, a drill bit attached to a spindle that was spun by a bowstring wrapped around it. The carpenter held a piece on top of the spindle, pressing down while moving the bow back and forth, spinning the drill bit. It was slow but effective, capable of drilling clean holes through wood. The carpenter's square ensured right. Angles, critical for furniture and building construction. The square was usually made from wood, two pieces joined at precisely 90 degrees, used to mark right angles and check the squareness of work. Plumb bobs, weighted strings, ensured vertical alignment in construction. Measuring tools included marked rods for length and folding rulers made from hinged wooden sections. Perhaps the most important carpenter's tool was knowledge, the accumulated understanding of how wood behaved, how different species responded to cutting and shaping, how joints should be designed for strength, how to select timber for specific purposes. This knowledge wasn't written down, it was passed through apprenticeship. Young boys working with experienced carpenters, learning by watching, by practicing, by making mistakes, and being corrected. A skilled Egyptian carpenter could build boats, construct furniture, frame buildings, create decorative woodwork, all with relatively simple tools. The tools were extensions of the craftsman's hands and mind, channels for expressing knowledge and skill accumulated over a lifetime. The finest Egyptian furniture, even royal furniture found in tombs, was made with these simple tools. Elaborate inlay work, precise joinery, smooth finishes, all achieved with adzes, saws, chisels, and drills. No power tools, no precision measuring instruments beyond marked rods and squares, just skill, knowledge, and patient labor. Textile production was another major industry requiring specialized tools. Egyptians wore primarily linen, made from flax plants that grew abundantly in Egypt. Processing flax into linen was labor-intensive, requiring multiple steps and specialized tools at each stage. Flax cultivation used the same basic agricultural tools already described, plows, sickles, though flax harvesting required care not to damage the long fibers in the stalks. After harvesting, flax stalks were retted, soaked in water to rot away the woody parts and leave the useful fibers. Retting required large tanks or pools and took weeks, creating a terribly foul smell that made flax processing facilities universally unpopular neighbors. After retting, the flax was dried and then processed to separate the fibers from remaining woody material. This was done by beating the dried stalks with wooden mallets on stone surfaces, breaking up the brittle woody parts while leaving the flexible fibers intact. The fibers were then combed or hackled through implements with metal spikes, pulling out short fibers and aligning the long fibers parallel to each other. The prepared fibers then had to be spun into thread. This was done with spindles, simple but effective tools, consisting of a stick with a weight, called a whirl, attached near one end. The spinner attached fibers to the spindle, gave it a twist to start it spinning, and then drew out more fibers as the spinning spindle twisted them into thread. The weight of the whirl kept the spindle spinning, maintaining tension on the forming thread. Spinning was tedious, repetitive work, done primarily by women and girls. A spinner could work for hours, producing thread slowly, steadily. The skill was in drawing out the fibers evenly, maintaining consistent thread thickness, keeping the spindle spinning smoothly. Good spinners produced fine, even thread. Poor spinners produced lumpy, weak thread that made inferior cloth. The spun thread was then woven into fabric on looms. Egyptian looms came in several types. The horizontal ground loom was common in earlier periods, two beams staked to the ground with warp threads stretched between them. The weaver sat on the ground and worked the weft threads through the warp using a shuttle and heddle to lift alternating warp threads. Later, vertical looms became more common, large frames standing upright with warp threads hanging from the top beam, weighted at the bottom. The weavers stood and worked from bottom to top, passing the shuttle through the sheet created by lifting heddle rods. Vertical looms could produce much longer pieces of fabric and were easier on the weaver's back than constantly bending over a ground loom. Weaving required other tools. Shuttles carried the weft thread back and forth through the warp. Beaters, flat pieces of wood, were used to pack the weft threads tightly together, creating dense, strong fabric. Heddles, sets of loops or rods that lifted alternating warp threads, created the shed through which the shuttle passed. Pattern heddles allowed creation of patterns and textures in the fabric. The finished fabric had to be finished, washed, sometimes bleached in the sun, sometimes beaten to soften it. Linen naturally ranges from dark brown to nearly white, depending on how it's processed. Fine white linen was the most prized, requiring extensive processing and bleaching. Coarse, brownish linen was much cheaper and used for everyday clothing and household textiles. All of these steps, from growing flax to finished fabric, required tools, and most of these tools were handmade by the people who used them. Spindles were carved from wood, loom beams were selected and shaped, shuttles were crafted. The tools themselves were products of other crafts, woodworking, stoneworking, metalworking, all interconnected in a complex web of specialization and exchange. Egyptian craftspeople working with other materials, stone, metal, leather, pottery, each had their own specialized tool sets. Stone workers used copper and later bronze chisels, wooden mallets, and enormous patience to carve hard stone. The technique was simple but effective. Place the chisel against the stone, strike it with the mallet, move the chisel slightly, strike again, repeat thousands, millions of times, slowly removing material, gradually shaping the stone. For harder stones like granite or quartzite, even bronze chisels barely made a dent. Stone workers used stone pounders, hard stone balls, or cylinders used to pound softer stone or to wear away harder stone through persistent percussion. They also used abrasives, sand combined with water, rubbed back and forth across stone surfaces to slowly grind away material. Drilling into stone required copper drill bits and sand abrasive, the drill spinning while sand and water created a grinding paste that did the actual cutting. The work was incredibly slow. Carving a stone statue could take months or years. Creating the stone sarcophagi found in royal tombs required teams of workers laboring for months, chiseling away material, smoothing surfaces, carving hieroglyphs and decorations. The tools were simple, but the accumulated labor was staggering. Yet Egyptians produced thousands of stone sculptures, temples, obelisks, monuments, all carved with these basic tools and enormous investments of human labor. Metalworkers needed different tools. Copper and bronze were worked by melting the metal in clay crucibles heated in charcoal furnaces. Bellows, leather bags with wooden handles, were pumped to force air into the fire, increasing the temperature enough to melt copper. The molten metal was poured into molds or cast into ingots for later working. Metal could be shaped by hammering while hot or cold. Anvils provided a hard surface against which to hammer metal. Hammers came in various sizes and shapes for different purposes. Files and scrapers shaped and smoothed metal. Punches created decorative patterns. Chasing tools pushed metal into desired shapes. All these tools were themselves made from metal, a bootstrap problem that required careful tool maintenance and periodic reforging as tools wore out. Gold, which Egypt possessed in abundance from Nubian mines, was soft enough to be worked cold. Goldsmiths used mallets, anvils, and punches to shape gold sheet into jewelry and decorative objects. They created granulation, tiny gold spheres arranged in patterns and fused to gold surfaces. They made filigree, delicate gold wire twisted into lacy designs. They set stones, created inlay work, and crafted the elaborate gold jewelry found in royal tombs, all with simple tools and extraordinary skill. Pottery production, essential for creating storage containers, cooking vessels, and tableware, required different equipment. The potter's wheel was one of Egypt's great innovations, allowing rapid, consistent production of round vessels. The wheel was a flat disc, usually wooden, mounted on a vertical axle. The potter spun the wheel by hand or with a foot pedal while shaping wet clay with both hands, pulling it up into desired forms. The skill of wheel throwing took years to master. The potter had to center the clay on the spinning wheel, a tricky process requiring feel and practice. Then pull the clay upward evenly, creating walls of consistent thickness. Then shape the form, narrow the neck, flare the rim, add handles or spouts, all while the wheel spun, all by feel and experience. A skilled potter could produce dozens of identical vessels in a day, each one perfectly formed, each one requiring just a few minutes at the wheel. The thrown vessels were then dried, decorated if desired, and fired in kilns. Egyptian kilns were simple updraft kilns, chambers where pottery was stacked and fire was built below. The heat rose through the chamber, baking the pottery hard. Temperature control was critical, but imprecise, managed by controlling the fuel and airflow. Potters developed an intuitive sense for firing, understanding when the kiln was hot enough, how long to fire, when to stop, and let the kiln cool slowly to prevent cracking. Pottery making also required clay preparation tools. Clay had to be dug, cleaned of stones and debris, tempered with sand or crushed pottery to prevent cracking during firing, and wedged to remove air bubbles. Wedging was done on wooden boards, the potter cutting and slamming the clay repeatedly to expel air. Smoothing tools, pieces of pottery or stone, were used to finish surfaces before firing. Decorating tools, created in sized patterns or applied relief decorations. Leather workers used knives to cut hides, awls to punch holes, needles to sew pieces together. The knives were typically bronze blades with wooden handles, kept sharp through careful maintenance. Awls were pointed metal tools used to pierce holes through leather for stitching. The holes had to be carefully placed and sized to allow thread to pass while keeping the seam tight. Needles for leather work were larger and sturdier than textile needles, capable of penetrating thick hide. Leather was prepared through laborious processes. Raw hides were scraped to remove flesh and fat, then treated to prevent decay and make the leather supple. Various tanning methods were used, involving plant materials, animal fats, and sometimes mineral salts. The treated leather was then cut and sewn into sandals, bags, clothing, shields, harnesses, and countless other items. Each item required appropriate tools and specialized knowledge. Basketry, the weaving of reeds, grasses, and palm fronds into containers and mats, required no complex tools beyond knives to cut materials. But the skill was considerable. Baskets were woven using various techniques, coiled basketry spiraling from a center, wicker work weaving between structural elements, plaiting crossing strips at right angles. Each technique produced different structural properties and appearance. Basket makers selected materials carefully: palm fronds for large, sturdy baskets, reed for fine work, grasses for soft, flexible items. The materials were split, trimmed, and sometimes dyed before weaving. The weaver worked by hand, no tools beyond fingers, creating complex patterns and shapes through repetitive motions learned over years. Baskets were everywhere in Egyptian life, used for carrying, storing, serving food, hauling grain, transporting goods. They were cheap to make, requiring only time and readily available materials, making them accessible to everyone. Rope and cordage making required tools for processing fibers and twisting them into strong lines. Flax, papyrus, palm fiber, and hair from various animals all served as cordage materials. The fibers were processed to remove non-fibrous material, then combed to align them. Rope was made by twisting fibers together, using simple tools or just hands and thighs. The technique involved continuous rolling and twisting, adding new fibers as the rope lengthened, maintaining consistent tension. Rope making was often done by groups working together, one person feeding fiber while others walked backward, twisting the forming rope. Large ropes required multiple strands, twisted together in a process that could involve many workers. The finished rope was used for everything from tying bundles to rigging ships to hauling stone blocks during construction projects. Egyptian rope, when kept dry, was remarkably strong and durable, surviving in some cases for thousands of years in tombs. In Egyptian households, countless smaller tools served daily needs. Combs carved from wood or bone had fine teeth for removing lice and untangling hair. Mirrors were polished bronze discs, reflective enough to show a face, though not with the clarity of modern glass mirrors. They were often mounted on decorated wooden handles and were prized possessions, especially for women. Cosmetic preparation and application required specialized tools. Stone palettes, flat stones with shallow depressions, were used to grind and mix eye paint. The makeup itself came from minerals, ground into powder and mixed with oil or fat to create paste. Malachite provided green eye paint, galena provided black coal, ochre provided red for cheeks and lips. The grinding process used small stone pestles, miniature versions of grain grinding tools, crushing the minerals into fine powder. Applicators for makeup were thin sticks or rods, often made from wood or reed, sometimes with shaped tips. The applicator was dipped into the prepared cosmetic paste and carefully applied around the eyes, creating the distinctive Egyptian eye makeup look. This wasn't just vanity. The makeup had practical purposes, reducing glare, repelling insects, and providing some protection against eye infections in Egypt's dusty environment. Razors allowed Egyptians to shave body hair, a practice common among both men and women. Egyptian razors were typically bronze blades, sharpened to a fine edge, and used carefully to avoid cuts. Shaving was done wet, using water or oils to soften hair and lubricate the skin. It required skill and care, especially around sensitive areas. Barbers were professionals, offering shaving services in addition to haircutting. Haircutting tools included scissors, two blades joined at a pivot point, operated by squeezing. Egyptian scissors were smaller and less effective than modern spring scissors, but they worked. Cutting hair also used knives, carefully trimming and shaping. Wealthy Egyptians visited barbers regularly. Poor Egyptians cut their own hair or had family members do it, using whatever sharp implements were available. Medical tools show Egyptian attempts to treat injury and illness. Surgical knives, bronze blades with wooden handles were used to cut tissue. Forceps helped extract embedded objects. Probes examined wounds, needles stitched cuts closed. The effectiveness of these tools was limited by lack of understanding of infection, sterilization, and anatomy, but Egyptian doctors tried, developing procedures and treatments that sometimes helped and sometimes made things worse. Dental tools attempted to address the universal problem of tooth decay and wear. Egyptian dental problems were severe, the result of gritty bread and lack of modern dentistry. Dental tools included picks for removing decay and extractors for pulling teeth that couldn't be saved. Neither procedure was pleasant, performed without anesthesia, beyond perhaps strong beer or opium-based painkillers if available. Tooth extraction was done by gripping the tooth with a tool and rocking it back and forth until it loosened enough to pull. Measuring tools allowed Egyptians to quantify the world. Cubit rods, sticks marked with divisions based on the royal cubit. The distance from elbow to fingertip allowed consistent length measurements. Different cubit standards existed: royal cubits for official measurements, common cubits for everyday use. The cubit was subdivided into palms and fingers, smaller units for more precise work. Weight measurements used balance scales, beams with pans suspended from each end. Objects to be weighed went in one pan. Standard weights went in the other until the beam balanced, indicating the object's weight. Stone weights in various standard sizes allowed consistent weighing. The weights were carefully made and checked against official standards to prevent cheating. Volume measurements used standardized containers, pottery vessels of known capacity. Grain was measured by filling these containers, leveling the top, and counting how many containers were filled. Liquid was measured similarly. The standards varied by commodity and purpose, creating a complex system that scribes had to learn thoroughly. Writing implements were essential for Egypt's literate elite. The scribe's palette was a distinctive object, a flat piece of wood or stone with shallow depressions for holding ink cakes, typically red and black. Reed pens, stems cut at an angle and chewed or cut to create a brush-like tip, were used to apply ink to papyrus or other writing surfaces. The scribe carried his kit in a wooden box or leather bag, including the palette, pens, spare reeds, a water container for wetting ink, and often a papyrus burnisher for smoothing writing surfaces. The kit represented professional identity. Scribes were the educated elite, the administrators and record keepers who made Egyptian bureaucracy function. Their tools were symbols of status and skill. Papyrus production itself required specialized knowledge and tools. Papyrus plants were harvested from marshes, the stems cut and stripped. The inner pith was cut into thin strips, which were laid out in 2 layers at right angles. The layers were pounded together, pressed and dried, the natural plant sugars bonding the strips into a smooth writing surface. The tools for papyrus making included knives for cutting, wooden mallets for pounding, weights for pressing, and smoothing stones for finishing. The process required skill to create good quality papyrus, sheets that were smooth, strong, and took ink well. Poor quality papyrus was rough, fragile, prone to tearing. The best papyrus was a valuable commodity, exported throughout the Mediterranean world. Gaming pieces and boards show that Egyptians, like people everywhere, enjoyed leisure activities. Senet, Egypt's most popular board game, used a rectangular board with 30 squares and playing pieces moved. According to throw sticks or dice, the boards ranged from simple scratch grids in the dirt to elaborate wooden boxes inlaid with ivory and precious materials. The playing pieces were often simple carved wood or stone, though wealthy Egyptians had elaborate pieces made from expensive materials. The throw sticks, used to determine moves, were flat sticks marked on one side, thrown together and counted based on how many landed, marked side up. Simpler than dice, but serving the same purpose. Other games used different boards and pieces. 20 squares, a game similar to backgammon, used a smaller board and different rules. Mayhen, a snake-shaped board game, used a spiraling track and lion-shaped game pieces. The rules of these ancient games are often unclear, lost to time, but the boards and pieces survive, evidence of universal human desire for entertainment and competition. Children's toys show parents' efforts to amuse their children. Dolls made from wood, pottery, or even mud, sometimes with movable limbs attached with string. Balls made from leather stuffed with reeds or straw. Spinning tops, small wooden cones spun by winding string around them and pulling. Simple pull toys, small wooden animals, or carts with wheels attached to strings, all handmade by parents or craftspeople, all reflecting the same basic forms that children's toys still take today. Music required instruments, and Egyptian instruments show sophisticated understanding of sound production. Harps range from small portable instruments to enormous standing harps taller than a person. They had wooden frames and gut or fiber strings plucked with fingers to produce melodic notes. The construction required careful selection of resonant wood and proper tensioning of strings. Flutes were made from reed or wood with holes along the length, producing different notes when covered or uncovered. Making a good flute required understanding of acoustics, at least intuitively, knowing where to place holes to produce desired notes. Drums used wooden frames with animal hides stretched tight across the top, struck with hands or sticks. Sistra, rattled sacred to Hathor, used metal frames with loose metal rods that jangled when shaken. Every instrument required tools to make. Woodworking tools shaped harp frames and flute bodies. Leather working tools prepared drum heads. Metal working tools created sistrum components. The interconnection of crafts supported each other, creating a comprehensive material culture where specialists produced tools and goods for others, while depending on others' specializations for their own needs. Religious objects required their own specialized production. Amulets, small charms worn for protection, were mass-produced in stone or faience using molds. The molds were carved with designs, liquid faience was poured in, and the hardened object was removed, showing fine detail from the mold. Thousands of amulets survive, showing popular religious beliefs and the scale of production. Offering tables, stone slabs with carved channels and depressions for liquid offerings required stoneworking skills. The tables had to be smooth, properly shaped, with functioning drainage channels. Carving them required the same tools and techniques used for sculpture, but applied to functional objects rather than purely decorative ones. Canopic jars, used to hold organs removed during mummification, were specialized pottery forms with distinctive lids representing protective deities. Potters made these jars to standard sizes and forms, understanding their ritual purpose while applying their craft skills. The jars show the intersection of religious belief and practical craft production. Embalming tools show Egyptian funeral practices' technical aspects. Bronze hooks extracted brain tissue through the nose, Knives made incisions for removing organs. The tools were specialized, designed for delicate work on human tissue. Embalmers were specialists knowing anatomy, preservation techniques, and ritual requirements. Their tools, while macabre to modern sensibilities, were essential for religious practices central to Egyptian culture. Lighting in Egyptian homes used simple oil lamps, small pottery bowls with a spout to hold a wick. The wick, usually twisted linen or papyrus fiber, sat in oil, olive oil, or castor oil, burning slowly. The lamps provided minimal light, enough to see nearby, but not enough to illuminate a room. Egyptians lived with darkness, going to bed shortly after sunset and waking at dawn, their activities governed by natural light. Wealthier homes used more lamps, creating somewhat better lighting. Candles were rare and expensive, made from tallow or beeswax, used only in temples or by the wealthy. Torches, bundles of reeds, or sticks soaked in oil or resin provided brighter light, but burned quickly and were used mainly outdoors or for processions. Furniture in Egyptian homes was relatively sparse. Beds were simple wooden frames with woven reed or leather mattresses. Stools and chairs had wooden frames, sometimes with leather or woven seats. Tables were low and small, used for serving food rather than dining. Storage was in pottery jars, wooden chests, or woven baskets. Everything was handmade, using the tools already described, producing functional, if not elaborate, furnishings. Wealthy Egyptians had more elaborate furniture, with inlays, carved decorations, and better craftsmanship. But even royal furniture was made with basic tools, showing what skilled craftsmen could achieve. The difference wasn't in tools, but in materials, time investment, and skill level. A carpenter, making a simple stool for a farmer, used the same adze and saw as a carpenter making an elaborate chair for a noble. The tools were the same. The expertise and materials differed. Egyptian tools and objects taken together show a society that was fundamentally practical. Objects were made to be used to solve problems to enable life in Egypt's unique environment. Decoration existed but was secondary to function. A grinding stone didn't need to be beautiful, it needed to grind grain effectively. A fish hook didn't need ornamentation, it needed to catch fish reliably. This practicality reflected Egyptian worldview and circumstances. Resources were limited, labor was valuable, objects that didn't work well were wasteful. So Egyptians developed tools and techniques that maximized effectiveness while minimizing waste. They used local materials whenever possible. They repaired rather than replaced. They adapted designs slowly and carefully, testing changes before adopting them widely. The conservatism of Egyptian material culture is striking. Tools used in the New Kingdom, 1500 years into pharaonic history, weren't dramatically different from tools used in the Old Kingdom. The same basic forms persisted. Grinding stones remained saddle querns. Sickles remained flint-bladed wooden tools, later bronze, but similar in form. Plows remained light wooden ards. This wasn't because Egyptians were uncreative or resistant to change. It was because these tools worked well, reliably, year after year, generation after generation. When changes occurred, they came slowly. The introduction of bronze improved tools gradually, making blades more durable and easier to sharpen. But it didn't revolutionize tool forms. Bronze sickles looked like flint sickles. Bronze chisels looked like copper chisels. The improvement was in performance, not in fundamental design. Only with iron, arriving very late in Egyptian history, did tool capabilities change significantly, and even then, the changes were evolutionary rather than revolutionary. The objects Egyptians used daily created a material culture that was stable, functional, and remarkably sustainable. Objects were made from renewable resources, wood, plant fibers, leather, or from materials that didn't deplete through use like stone. Metal was precious and recycled obsessively. Broken bronze tools were melted down and recast. Nothing was discarded if it had any remaining utility. This sustainability wasn't ideologically motivated. Egyptians weren't consciously trying to minimize environmental impact. They simply couldn't afford waste. Resources were limited, labor was expensive, repairing was cheaper than replacing. So objects were used hard, maintained carefully, repaired repeatedly, and only discarded when they absolutely couldn't function anymore. The broken grinding stones found in archaeological sites are often worn down to thin, barely functional fragments, evidence that they were used until using them further became impossible. The knowledge embedded in Egyptian tools is as important as the physical objects. Each tool represented accumulated understanding, generations of experience in tool use and manufacture, refinement of forms and techniques. A carpenter teaching his son wasn't just showing him how to hold an adze, he was transmitting generations of knowledge about wood selection, tool maintenance, cutting techniques, joint design. The physical tool was just the visible manifestation of invisible knowledge. This knowledge transmission happened entirely through apprenticeship and practice. There were no instruction manuals, no technical drawings, no written records of techniques. Everything was learned by watching, by practicing, by making mistakes and being corrected. Young people learned crafts by working alongside experienced craftsmen, starting with simple tasks and gradually progressing to more complex work as skills developed. The system worked because Egyptian society valued craft knowledge and provided pathways for transmission. Crafts often ran in families, fathers teaching sons, mothers teaching daughters. But apprenticeship also occurred across family lines, talented young people learning from masters who weren't relatives. The goal was preserving and transmitting knowledge that the society needed to function. The tools themselves, as physical objects, were relatively simple, but the knowledge of how to use them effectively was complex and sophisticated. A bronze chisel is a simple object, a blade attached to a handle. But knowing how to sharpen it properly, how to angle it for different cuts, how much force to apply, how to work with the wood grain rather than against it, that knowledge took years to develop. The tool was the vehicle, the knowledge was the content. Egyptian tools also reflect social organization and specialization. Not everyone made their own tools. Metalworkers made bronze tools. Potters made pottery tools like baking molds. Woodworkers made wooden handles and components. There was exchange, trade, specialization. A farmer might make his own wooden hoe handle, but traded grain to a metalworker for the bronze hoe blade. He couldn't smelt copper or forge bronze. That required specialized knowledge and equipment, but he could provide food that freed the metalworker from farming. This interdependence created complex social and economic networks. Craft specialists depended on farmers for food. Farmers depended on craft specialists for tools. Everyone depended on traders to move goods around. The tools, seemingly simple objects, were actually nodes in webs of social and economic relationships spanning entire communities and regions. The archaeological survival of Egyptian tools is uneven. Pottery survives well, buried in Egypt's dry conditions, providing abundant evidence of ceramic forms and production. Stone tools survive excellently, grinding stones and stone vessels lasting indefinitely. Metal tools survive poorly, corroded or recycled in antiquity, leaving gaps in our knowledge. Wood, leather and fiber objects survive only in exceptional circumstances, usually in tombs or extremely dry sites. This survival bias affects our understanding. We know far more about Egyptian stone and pottery objects than about wooden or fiber ones. Yet, wooden and fiber objects were probably more common in daily life. A household might own dozens of baskets but only a few stone vessels. The baskets decayed, leaving no archaeological trace. The stone vessels survived, creating an impression that stone was more common than it actually was. Tomb contexts preserve unusual objects because Egyptians buried goods with the dead. Tombs provide most of our evidence for wooden tools, leather objects, fiber items, but tomb goods aren't necessarily representative of daily use. They were often specially made for burial, idealized versions rather than worn work tools. They show us what objects looked like when new, but not how they looked after years of hard use. The everyday objects that do survive show wear patterns, repairs, adaptations that reflect actual use. A wooden tool with a replaced handle shows that handles broke and were repaired rather than the entire tool being discarded. A pottery jar with a broken rim, ground smooth, shows adaptation to damage. A metal tool with a replaced blade shows the value of the handle and the fungibility of blades. These wear patterns and repairs tell us about Egyptian attitudes toward objects, about maintenance practices, about the economics of tool use. Experimental archaeology, modern people making and using replicas of ancient tools, provides insights that studying artifacts alone cannot. Experimenters discovered that Egyptian tools, which might seem primitive, are actually quite effective when used skillfully. A bronze chisel is perfectly adequate for woodworking if you know how to sharpen and use it. A saddle quern can grind grain effectively if you develop the technique. A wooden plow works fine in soft post-flood soil. The experiments also reveal how much skill and practice ancient tools required. Modern people trying to use an adze for the first time struggle with control and precision. But after practice, the tool becomes natural, an extension of the hand. The experiments show that tool effectiveness depends not just on the tool, but on the user's skill. Egyptian craftsmen weren't working with inadequate tools. They were working with appropriate tools that required expertise to use well. The objects also reveal cultural priorities and values. The enormous investment in grain grinding tools, the fact that every household had multiple grinding stones and that grinding consumed hours of daily labor, shows how fundamental grain was to Egyptian diet and economy. The sophistication of fishing equipment shows the importance of fish as a protein source. The variety of textile tools shows that cloth production was a major economic activity. Luxury goods, jewelry and cosmetics, and fine furniture show what wealthy Egyptians valued, but the everyday tools show what everyone needed to survive. Grinding stones, cooking pots, water jars, simple clothing, basic furniture. These objects define normal Egyptian life far more than golden treasures did. The treasures are spectacular and get all the attention, but the ordinary objects, boring and common, actually mattered more for understanding how most Egyptians lived. Egyptian tools and everyday objects also show innovation and problem solving. The development of the bronze alloy, mixing copper with tin to create a harder, more durable metal, was a significant technological achievement. The invention of the potter's wheel dramatically increased pottery production. The refinement of mummification techniques required developing specialized tools and methods. Egyptians were not static or unchanging. They innovated constantly, improving tools and techniques incrementally over centuries. But the innovations were practical, driven by need rather than novelty. Egyptians adopted bronze because it made better tools, not because bronze was fashionable. They used potter's wheels because they increased production, not because wheels were exciting new technology. Every adoption of new tools or methods had to prove itself through practical advantage. This pragmatism meant changes came slowly, but usually represented genuine improvements. The Egyptian toolkit, taken as a whole, was remarkably complete. Egyptians had tools for every necessary task: agriculture, food processing, construction, craft production, warfare, writing, domestic life. Everything required tools, and Egyptians developed appropriate tools for each purpose. Some were simple, some sophisticated, but all were functional and effective in their contexts. The tools were also remarkably durable in design, if not always in material. Many tool forms persisted for thousands of years because they worked well. The grinding stone's form barely changed across 3 millennia. The adze remained essentially the same from Old Kingdom to Ptolemaic times. When designs work, when they're well adapted to their purposes and materials, there's no reason to change them. Egyptian conservatism in tool design reflected the success of existing forms. Comparing Egyptian tools to contemporary tools from other civilizations shows both similarities and differences. The basic problems, grinding grain, cutting wood, catching fish, were universal. Solutions were often similar, grinding stones and saws and fish hooks appearing across cultures, but details differed, reflecting local materials, specific needs, cultural preferences. Egyptian tools were distinctively Egyptian, adapted to Nile Valley conditions, and integrated into Egyptian cultural practices. The tools also reveal Egypt's connections to other regions. Bronze came from trade networks spanning the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Certain wood species were imported. Some stone types came from distant quarries. The tools themselves were local products, but the materials and some technologies came from broader networks. Egypt wasn't isolated. It participated in wider technological and economic systems while maintaining distinctive local forms. Looking at Egyptian tools and everyday objects also reveals the fundamental humanity of ancient Egyptians. They faced the same basic problems we do. They needed to eat, to shelter themselves, to make clothing, to store possessions, to work, to raise children. The solutions they developed, the tools they created, were appropriate to their circumstances, but addressed universal needs. A modern person could pick up many Egyptian tools and, with a bit of practice, use them effectively. The gap isn't as wide as the millennia might suggest. The objects humanize ancient Egypt in ways that royal monuments cannot. Pyramids are impressive but alien, so far beyond normal human scale that they feel disconnected from everyday life. But a grinding stone, a fish hook, a simple bowl, these are human-scale objects used by people living human-scale lives. They connect us across time, showing that the people who used these objects 3,000 years ago weren't fundamentally different from us. They were people dealing with daily life, using tools to solve problems, making do with available resources. The study of Egyptian tools and everyday objects is ongoing. Archaeologists continue excavating sites that yield new discoveries. Experimental archaeologists refine understanding of how objects were made and used. Scientists apply new analytical techniques to determine materials and manufacturing methods. Each new study adds detail to our understanding, filling gaps, correcting misconceptions, revealing complexity in what seems simple. But the basic picture is clear. Ancient Egyptians created a comprehensive material culture adapted to their environment and needs. They developed tools and objects that were functional, durable, and sustainable. They passed knowledge across generations through apprenticeship and practice. They maintained remarkable cultural continuity while adapting to changing circumstances. And they left behind, in tombs and trash heaps and archaeological sites, the physical evidence of their daily lives, the boring, essential objects that made Egyptian civilization possible. The tools and everyday objects of ancient Egypt aren't as spectacular as golden treasures. They don't inspire awe like massive temples. They don't make dramatic museum displays or stunning photographs. But they tell the real story of ancient Egypt, the story of how millions of people over 3,000 years lived, worked, ate, made clothing, built homes, raised families, practiced crafts, and went about the unglamorous but essential business of daily existence. Every grinding stone tells of hours spent preparing food. Every fish hook tells of time spent on the Nile, pulling sustenance from the river's waters. Every tool tells of a craftsman's skill, knowledge passed from teacher to student, practical understanding accumulated through generations. Every everyday object tells of lives lived, problems solved, needs met with available resources, and human ingenuity. This is the Egypt that mattered to most Egyptians. Not the pharaohs and priests, not the temples and tombs, but the daily round of work and family, sustained by simple tools used skillfully, maintained carefully, replaced reluctantly. The Egypt of grinding stones and fish hooks, of plows and sickles, of pots and baskets, of looms and spindles. The Egypt that actually existed day to day, year to year, for ordinary people living ordinary lives in extraordinary circumstances. The tools and objects survived, at least some of them, preserved in Egypt's dry climate and careful burial practices. They waited thousands of years to be discovered, excavated, studied, and understood. And now they speak, quietly but clearly, telling us about the people who made them, used them, depended on them. They tell us that ancient Egyptians were resourceful, practical, skilled, and fully human. They faced challenges, solved problems, adapted to circumstances, and created a material culture that sustained one of history's great civilizations. The boring objects, the everyday tools, the mundane items that fill archaeological storage rooms rather than museum galleries. These are the heart of ancient Egypt. These are the objects that mattered, that made life possible, that sustained generations. And understanding them, appreciating their design and purpose, and the knowledge they represent, gives us a far more complete and accurate picture of ancient Egypt than any number of golden treasures or massive monuments ever could.